Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth and final session of our virtual Johnson County Master Gardeners Continuing Education programs. I am Doug Garretts. Most of you know me as Vice Chair of the Master Gardeners Steering Committee and editor of the Times newsletter. Today I'll be your moderator, and Shannon Balicki is our meeting host. A special thanks to Linda Schreiber for all the work, all the background work to pull these presentations together. A little bit of housekeeping before we continue. This is the first year we've done virtual education sessions, and hopefully the last for a long time. But we do appreciate your patience in case we encounter any technical difficulties. A reminder to participants to keep your mic muted as the presentation is being recorded by City Channel 4 for rebroadcast at a later date. Viewers are encouraged to type questions into the chat feature of Zoom at any time, and you can find that toward the bottom of your screen, or should be able to. We will get to as many questions as time allows. Today I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Steve Hendricks, presenting When Wild Bees Come to Town, Why We Need Them and What to Do to Help. Dr. Hendricks, University of Iowa Professor Emeritus, will explore the biology and status of wild bees and honeybees on native prairies, farms, and urban areas in this presentation. An evaluation of pollinator supply and demand in urban areas will be discussed, and suggestions how we might encourage wild bees will be provided. Before retiring in 2015, Dr. Hendricks was a faculty member of the Department of Botany and Department of Biology for 40 years. During his career, he studied the ecology of plant-animal interactions before turning to bees. Because many prairie plants succeed as populations only if they have pollinators, he started studying wild bees in Iowa and almond groves of California. So Dr. Hendricks, the screen is yours.
All right. Okay. Are we up and going, it looks like? All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here on a Zoom Sunday. I think what Linda and I tried to do this last year, just as all of this was the COVID was hitting us, and so things got put off. I appreciate to talk to the Master Gardeners. You guys do such great work. I'm looking forward to sharing some of the things that we've learned about wild bees in the studies that we've been conducting. Really, the place to start is on sort of the importance of pollinators as a bit of background. Really, we're talking billions of dollars worth of services, ecological services that these pollinators are producing for us. They're giving us the fruits and berries and tomatillos and raspberries that we enjoy, that add variety to our diet, that add nutrition to our diet. We get all these nice vegetables out of it, squashes and tomatoes, some tomatoes, things like that. But we also get some huge crops that are pollinated by insects, by bees. And in this case, what you're looking at are almonds. And that is about a somewhere between $7 to $8 billion a year industry in California, worth mentioning solely because of the economic value. Almost as much economic value in California from almonds as there is from the wine crop. So I eat almonds and I drink wine. So I'm trying to help California as much as I can. The other thing that we need to point out about the importance of pollinators is that they are necessary for plant reproduction. And so probably the ones that we're most familiar with are the prairie plants that we have. We normally think of prairie plants as seas of grass, and while the abundance of plants on prairies is dominated by the grasses, the diversity of prairies depends on plants that are pollinated by insects. And so things like liatris that you see here at Maury Prairie, or this shot of Kaler Prairie. So all of these plants, these prairie forbs, most of them need insects for pollination. I wanted to introduce you to the pollinators because it is more than just bees, although the bees are actually the dominant pollinators of plants, even though they have fewer species than butterflies and moths. It's worth pointing out of the bees, of that 20,000 species that we think we have globally, that the honeybee is just one species. And so all of these other bees are not like honeybees. They are what we refer to now as wild bees or solitary bees. There are quite a few variety of plants that are pollinated by butterflies and moths. They have particular characteristics. There are, 100,000 species of butterflies and moths, but a smaller proportion actually do the pollination. There are a variety of flies that can also do pollination. Doug, that syrphid fly that you showed me is actually a pollinator and can do pollinations. So we have them out there. Some of them are very tricky. Some of them look enough like bees that they even fool me sometimes. We have some bird-pollinated plants. We have bat-pollinated plants. And then we have this miscellaneous category. And I suspect that virtually any animal, insect that you can come up with, somebody somewhere has found that it will pollinate a plant. And so there's just this whole tail of many organisms that do pollination. This, of course, is our most familiar pollinator. It's the honeybee. It's the one we know the most about. It is unique in a number of ways, one of which is that it is the only species of bee that actually lives in very large colonies. And so colonies of bees, like you see in these boxes from an almond grove, may have anywhere from 15 to 30,000 workers in there that are going out and foraging. Honeybees have a very, very long history, and you find evidence of that in all kinds of odd places. This is the top of a building in Prague in the Czech Republic, walking down a street. My wife looked up and said, "Hey, Steve, look at that." And I looked and went, "Wow, isn't that cool?" So there's honeybees with the old style nests. You can tell honeybees from other bees. One is that they're rather large, but they also have a unique wing pattern with these two cells that sort of look like fingers. If you see those with a bee resting on a plant, you're looking at a honeybee. And then one of the other things, one of those odd facts about bees that I like is that they have hairy eyeballs. And so you can see all these little tiny hairs on here. They are apparently using those in navigation somehow. We're not quite sure what they're doing, but there's not many bees that have those kinds of hairs on those eyeballs. If we're going to talk about honeybees, then we also need to talk about colony collapse disorder, which is rather unfortunate name because really what was occurring, and this started about 2006 and 7, that winter, was that honeybee keepers in Florida noticed that their bees were just disappearing. And so this is a photograph of a large number of dead bees, but this is rarely something that you would see. The bees literally just disappeared. People, of course, are very interested in that because of the economic importance of honeybees. And it turns out it's a hugely complex topic as to what is going on, why there is this disorder, this collapse of the colonies. Pests and pathogens play a big role in this. There's all kinds of things like mites. There's a large number of viruses. There are fungi that can cause honeybee deaths in colonies. There are all types of these environmental stressors that affect it and play a role, particularly the pesticides. Poor nutrition is another problem. And then now the advent of insect growth regulators for control of insect pests are also affecting the honeybees. And then lastly, the thing that has come up out of the genomic work and the complete identification of the genome of honeybees is that there are some oddities here that are affecting this colony collapse disorder we see. And that's one is that they do not have good immune systems. Honeybees, because they live in these large colonies, have behavioral characteristics of cleaning the colonies and getting rid of mites and trying to do those sorts of things. And so the thought is that there's been relaxed selection pressure on the immune systems in honeybees because of these behavioral characteristics. And then the other thing that comes out of the honeybees is that they're genetically similar. Okay, they're basically clones, and so they all are the same. So if anything gets in a colony that affects one of the workers, it is potentially going to affect all of them. Oh, and by the way, those are the mites that are attacking honeybee larvae. You can see these two mites that are sucking out the hemolymph on this particular larvae. So colony collapse disorder, it's still out there. It's still happening. Generally, we're looking at numbers of something like anywhere from 30 to 40% loss of honeybee colonies, particularly overwintering because of the stresses of that as well. So those numbers are staying steady. And so we're really not solving this problem at all. It's just hit a plateau of fairly large losses of colonies for the honeybee growers and honeybee keepers. So because of the problems with colony collapse disorder and the loss of those honeybees and the services they provide, people have turned to the idea that all those other bees, what we refer to as solitary bees, may in fact play a very important role in pollination of not only prairie plants, but also various crops. And we have a very large number of these. There's about 20,000 species globally, maybe 4,000 plus in the United States. We have, well, I'd have to revise this number. I think we're up to about 320 species in Iowa. We're expecting that it'll be similar to more thorough inventories in places like Illinois and Minnesota and Wisconsin. They have about 400 species. So we'll get there if we keep collecting. So that's how many we actually have here in the state of Iowa. Now, solitary bees are really quite different from honeybees in a number of respects, in that they are solitary. They are nesting solitarily. There is no colony. You can see here nest holes in the ground. Each female will have her own nest hole, and she will go out and collect pollen and provision the reproductive cells that are underground or in stems like you see here, like a leafcutter bee. And she will go out there and she will forage on her own. There's no recruitment, there's no workers, there's nobody doing this but her. And she will continue to do that, forage and provide reproductive cells for her whole adult life. And so the problem is, of course, is that the lifespan of the individual bees is really rather short, probably somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 weeks for an individual bee. That's only as long as they will live. One of the reasons we know this is so is because when we sample on prairies, We go out every month and do our collections, and we have almost a complete turnover of species that we're catching on a monthly basis. So whole species are coming and going during that growth, during that growing season. And so we'll come back and talk a little bit more about these cavity nesting bees, because it's important to provide nesting locations for them if you can. So why are we interested in wild bees? I mean, there's a lot of them out there, but they're all solitary. Well, one of the things that we know about why we would want to encourage wild bees and keep them healthy is that they are, in fact, important pollinators of some major crops. And this is an almond grove up in the Capay Valley in California. And the work that I did with a crew of people out there was that we were able to show that the wild bees were contributing about 15% of the pollination for the production of almonds. And turns out that 15%, which doesn't sound like all that much, the other 85% is with all those honeybee boxes that you see in almond groves. But the difference for an almond grower between a good crop of almonds, where they make a profit and can live for another year, and an excellent crop is this 15%. So when you boost the pollination of flowers from about 35% to maybe 45 or 50% of the flowers get pollinated, you get yourself a really, really good almond crop. Of course, in almonds, they have to be cross-pollinated, so pollen has to be moved from one variety to another, which is why wild bees are good for this, because they move between trees. So one row of these trees will be one variety, another row will be a different variety as a pollen donor. The other thing that we've been able to show with our research on prairies is that, in fact, the greater the diversity of wild bees that you have, the better the plant reproduction of prairie plants. And so we've shown this with a couple of plants. This is lead plant, Amorpha canescens, where we were able to show that bigger populations of the plant will attract a greater diversity of wild bees, and the greater diversity of wild bees leads to increased seed production by this prairie plant, as well as other plants. It does depend on whether or not the plant is a obligate outcrosser or not. Some plants have to have pollen from a different individual, others not. The more that it's obligate, the more important those bees are. And then the other thing that we were able to show when we were comparing the effectiveness of honeybees and wild bees in almond groves and their pollination was that we were very surprised to find that, in fact, the effectiveness of the wild bees was much greater than the effectiveness of honeybees. You're looking at the style of an almond flower here, and these are pollen tubes that are growing down through the style. And some of these little dots are just the pollen grains that have not germinated. And it turns out that the wild bees are more effective pollinators than the honeybees, because they spend longer times on a flower. The average time a honeybee spends on an almond flower is somewhere between 3 and 5 seconds. A wild bee may spend up to 30 to 40 to 50, even a minute or more on a flower, and therefore they're more effective pollinators. Well, we need to talk about bee declines, because that has been in the news a great deal. And so I wanted to talk about the evidence we have for bee declines in the US. One of the types of studies that we have are what are called failure to find studies. And this is where an area has been sampled a number of years ago. People go back out to the same area. They sample again and they say, well, of the species of bees that we found in 1950, how many are we finding now? And this has been a type of study that has been used both here and in Europe for bumblebees that clearly show losses of some species in some localities of bumblebees. There is an argument one can counter the results of these studies by saying, well, really all you need to do is go out there and collect more. If you went out and collected more, you'd find those bees that you think are gone. I would reply to that argument that I know these people that are doing these studies, and they are good collectors. They are good bee biologists. And I think that if they were there, they would have found the bees that they think are missing. The other kind of study we can do is a comparison over time. The problem is we don't have those kind of comparisons to make. We have one that is prominent in the literature from a little town in Illinois, in Carlinville, Illinois. And that was work that was done at the turn of the century in early 1900s by a guy named Charles Robertson. And what people have done is, because he did such extensive collections, you can go back and do recollections. And the way they do these is that you can go to Robinson's collections and you can randomly pull out of the database, for example, 100 individuals. And as you pull out those individuals, you can go, is it a different species or the same species of what we already have? And so as you collect more and more individuals or draw them from the collection, you get a curve that looks like this. And then in 100 individuals, you get maybe 18, 19 species, okay? In 1975, this blue line, you can see that it was actually not all that different. You know, statistically, that's not any different. And so really no loss of bees. But then you look at what happened when they went back 35 years later, and here's where we're seeing the loss of bees. You collect 100 bees and you do not get nearly as many species as you did either from his collection in 1960 or the resampling in 1975. But we don't have very many other studies like this where we have those old collections that were as thorough as Robertson's. The drivers of all of this are the typical kinds of ones we expect. It's habitat loss. When you lose the habitat, you're losing the floral resources, you're losing the nesting sites, all of which is likely driving down both bee abundance and diversity. And then the other culprit that we have to point out, it's the use of chemicals, and particularly in agricultural fields. And so while there may be some bees in a strip along a little waterway like you see here, or a swale like you see here, the use of chemicals in the fields is drifting over these and having an effect of that. And we also have, though, some other instances where things like there's been reestablishment of prairies along bike paths and things like that. So it is the loss of habitat that's really the big one up until the advent of chemicals. And now the habitat is pretty much gone. And now the chemicals are adding that other slam onto bee diversity. So what do we know about bee diversity that we think could help? And what could we start by doing? And one of the things that I would first want to point out is that we really have to pay attention to preserving our prairies because they are very important bee preserves. So this is Kaler Prairie up in Dickinson County. It has a huge diversity of bees. We've got about 160 or 70 species of bees off this 160-acre prairie. It's got roughly 300 species of flowering plants on it, so there's huge diversity of floral resources here. And those kinds of places we have to preserve. But one of the things we've also worked out in our research, as well as other people have done similar kinds of things, it's not just the prairie that we have to try to preserve. We have to preserve the landscape around it. So here's Kaler Prairie right here that you see here. And here's the landscape around Kaler Prairie. Our studies show that, in fact, the bee diversity at the prairie is related to the floral diversity up to 1 kilometer away from the center of the prairie. So the land surrounding a site will be as important to the bee diversity as at a site as the site itself. And so a prairie like Cowsill Prairie, which is almost completely surrounded by agricultural fields, even though it's as big as Kaler Prairie, actually bigger, has much lower bee diversity. One of the things that surprised us in the research that we did was that we went into this expecting, when we started sampling bees and little roadside remnants or even small fragments that might have pretty good plants in it, we thought there'll be fewer bees. It's smaller. There's not so much resource. This makes common sense. And what we found was that that is not true. So, for example, a railroad remnant like this, abandoned along a railway, but not mowed, not plowed, maybe occasionally burned if the engines set fire to it, or this kind of a roadside prairie, actually have as diverse a bee community as one of those larger prairies. We think it's because those little roadside prairies actually have fairly high plant diversity as well. And so other kinds of small sites, small prairie remnants, these are two of these little hill prairies that are up in northeast Iowa. They're called goat prairies. So you can see how steep this prairie is, but they're only a couple of acres. They're not big. They also have as good a diversity of bees as does a large prairie. So even small sites are worth preserving is the bottom line here, because they do serve as a resource, probably serving as an oasis in a way in a landscape filled with the agricultural kinds of fields. So we also got very interested in bees on farms, and we wanted to look at the produce farms here in east central Iowa to examine their bee diversity and how it compared to prairies and who was doing the pollination at these farms. Well, one of the things that surprised us was that wild bees do the vast majority of the flower visitation. It's not honeybees. It's the wild bees, our solitary bees, that are doing most of it. Even the farms that had honeybees were, the honeybees weren't important, probably because these farms are not growing crops in large enough quantities, large enough mass of flowering to attract honeybees to get the recruitment that the honeybees normally do. So the honeybees, even when they're there, we would catch some honeybees, but not many more. One of the things that came out of our study of the farms in comparisons with prairies is that although the diversity at farms is as good as a prairie, and they're as important as they are on prairies, there was some differences in the composition of the bee communities at farms, with some of the genera of bees being much more prevalent on farms than on prairies, and at least one genus of bees that was found on prairies but not in the farms to a greater degree, probably due to the cropping system and when crops are coming up, we think. So Iowa farms are using the wild bees, so all of that, those crop products you see at the farmer's market that are bee pollinated, it's mostly the wild bees that are doing it. I wanted to talk about the urban bee study that we did, the work with Dr. Heather Sander over in, it's the old geography department, and it's called Sustainability and Geographic Systems now, I think. They changed their name. And one of Heather's graduate students, Chang Zhao, who did a lot of the heavy lifting on this particular study with the modeling that we did. So what we did, we wanted to look at supply and demand. So we wanted to say, well, okay, are there enough bees to fill the needs of people growing plants and, you know, with gardens and things like that in Iowa City? I mean, is there a problem? Do we have not enough bees, or are they in the right place to do the pollination for people that have gardens? And so the first thing we did bee sampling in 7 different localities throughout Iowa City. when I first looked at this, I sort of went, wow, that's a weird shape to the boundary of Iowa City, but that's the way it is. For orientation, here's the river, here's University Heights. So to get you sort of oriented, and we sampled in 7 localities throughout Iowa City, throughout a whole summer. So it's a season's worth of data. It is with both net sampling, and then we use these little pan traps. They're a little plastic bowl about that big, about 4 or 5 inches in diameter, and we have them colored, and we fill them up with soapy water, and we catch bees that way. So we've sampled different techniques to get our data for the bees in these localities. And then we also went out and we surveyed for demand for pollinator services in all of the 9 neighborhoods of Iowa City. Took samples of these. This was Chang's work. We went out and cataloged numbers of front yard gardens, backyard vegetable gardens, community gardens, edible landscapes, everything where you had something growing that required, people were growing plants to either eat or for themselves or for community service things. And so then what we were able to do, and here I have to bow to Chang's incredible work with modeling all of the data to come up with a pattern of supply and demand across Iowa City. And this is what it looks like. When we sort of smooth out the data, we get supply that looks like this. Very good supply up here in the northeast part of the county. You'll recognize this is areas where there's fields, and Hickory Hill Park is up here. This area where supply is very low is all the downtown area, some of the industrialized area, the more business area. Here's University Heights again. We did not sample in University Heights. So this is where the bees are, our modeling suggests. This is where the demand is, all of those gardens, community gardens, edible landscapes, etc. And then this is the overlay of those two, putting them together, asking where supply and demand, how those shake out across the Iowa City landscape. So everything from here up indicates that there's really enough or more supply than the demand. And in fact, if you look at this and do the math on this, we're not doing too badly in Iowa City, because roughly 70 to 75% of the area of Iowa City has enough or more than enough bee supply for the demand that we were able to calculate. Where it goes kind of wonky is all of this area of downtown area and some of the built up areas here. Same thing for over in here, where we have less supply than demand. But overall, not too bad. In Iowa City, we're not doing too badly at all in most of the neighborhoods. We wanted to expand this work in the urban areas. Heather did, and she has been interested for many years in urban forests and sustainability. And so we wanted to ramp up, instead of just looking at plants bees use or plants that they feed on, we wanted to look at the whole forest. We wanted to do basically top to bottom, all in the same plots. And the idea was that her crew would be sampling the bees and sampling the trees and the birds and the mammals. And then we did shrubs, herbs, and the wild bees. But what we really wanted to do was to try and relate the data that we're finding on trees, birds, and mammals and bees and et cetera to both the biophysical characteristics, are the ones that I've always emphasized, how much diversity of plants there are, et cetera. We wanted to bring in whether there was socioeconomical factors involved in this, and then also sort of how the land is being used, to see if we can get a better picture of the whole urban forest and sort of what drives what we're seeing. We've just started on this project. We've got some data, but COVID kind of interrupted a lot of our both field work and our analyses because we couldn't get into the lab to do things. But let me tell you about the project itself. We had 9 locations that we sampled for bees. Here they are scattered through Iowa City. We had 2 plots for each one of these locations. Plots were generally very close to each other. They often might be very different, one along a bike trail, one in a suburban area. We use these 50 radius meter plots. We do our sampling throughout the summer. We're looking at shrubs and herbs for the bee stuff. They're doing trees. Again, we're doing our standard kind of sampling. These are the kind of sites we're looking at. We're looking at some of the low and middle income neighborhoods. This is up in North Liberty. This is closer to my area in Creekside. We did a lot of trails and parks as well to sort of compare to very nearby suburban areas. Did some older affluent neighborhoods. And then we also did some newer middle income neighborhoods, and that we could look at a variety of socioeconomical status as well as age and things like that. So the first thing that we wanted to do was to see if our bee abundance, which we could get, was related to any of the kinds of variables that we were measuring. And of course, you go into this with your preconceived ideas, and one of which was that, well, if you have more forest, you have less herbaceous vegetation. And if you have less herbaceous vegetation, you're going to have fewer bees. There's not as many plants for them to gather nectar and gather pollen. And so this data tells us that we're going to have to give up on that idea, and that there is no relationship between bee abundance and the percentage of the landscape in our plots that is covered with forest. And it didn't matter whether you went from almost no forest, some of those newer neighborhoods, to some of the ones like over in Manville Heights, where you may have 60% of the land covered with forest, canopy cover. Didn't matter. Forest didn't matter. So we went, well, okay, forest doesn't matter. Yeah, grasslands. Grasslands will matter. Well, no. Grasslands are the yellow dots, and you can see it's just this splurge of dots across our graph. Again, going from almost no grassland, basically we're talking, no lawns or anything like that, up to 70% didn't matter. So those kind of landscape features, forest, grassland. But then we said, okay, well, let's look at impervious surface, because if it's paved over, nothing's growing there. And there are no resources for bees. And surely there must be a relationship between the abundance of bees in a plot and how much of it has been asphalted over. Not so much. So bee abundance, again, it's just this scatter of black points in here. There's no relationship between bee abundance and the amount of impervious surface. But one of the things we're looking at, bee abundance is one variable of importance we want to look at, but we also want to look at bee richness. How many species of bees are there? And here's where we get our first data that we find that is showing a relationship, and that is the greater the plant richness, the greater the bee abundance in any of those 18 plots that we sampled. And so you can see when you get up to as much as 80 or 90 plants in one of those plots, you start getting a lot more bees. So plant abundance is, plant richness rather, is having an effect on bee abundance. We're just about at the point where we can start looking at not bee abundance, but bee richness, species richness. And we're very hopeful that, in fact, richness will also correlate with the bee richness, species richness, will correlate with plant richness. But we were very interested in these plots as to what are these plants that we're seeing in urban areas. And this is the kind of variation we've seen. We broke these categories down a little bit more, but for this graph, I wanted to just show you the species rank, okay, the number of sites where we got a particular species, in this case, red is introduced weeds, notice that the most abundant plants at these plots, in terms of in different plots, are going to be these introduced weeds that we get. And things like creeping Charlie, things like dandelion, other kinds of plants like that. Garlic mustard, I think, popped up quite a few times. These introduced weedy species. Then notice that you have to get up to 10 species before you ever hit a native plant in terms of the number of sites at these that we would have a native species. And in fact, if you sort of look overall, the native species do not make up, a major portion of the plant variation in these urban plots. It's introduced weeds and it's cultivars, and then there are some of the native species. I wanted, because I'm talking to you guys as gardeners, talk a little bit about who these plants are. And so this is sort of the percentage of sightings. How many times did we see plants in the sunflower family, etc., across here? And of course, it's the sunflower family and the pea family are accounting for a large proportion of our sightings of plants in here. We get lots of mints, roses, hostas are very popular, and the bees like them, pink family. And onward, this trails out quite a bit over here because I think we had about 20 or so different plant families. But it's the sunflower family, the pea family, the mint family, and the rose family that really, and with the lilies in there, that are the major plants that the bees are using in these plots that we sampled. So one of the things I like to do is talk about what to plant. We got very interested in this. A colleague of mine, when we looked at our bee data from prairies, we wanted to ask, are there any particular plants that attract bees in higher number of species, higher diversity than you would expect given sort of local abundance at a prairie? So we know that if a plant species is very abundant at a prairie, you will get a lot of species of bees visiting it. But we can statistically take out an effect of the number of plants, how big the population is, take out that effect, and then ask, after you account for the size of the plant population, is the plant still attracting more bees than you would expect? And indeed, there are some plant species that pop out of this analysis that we did with a colleague now at Illinois. And so we do find that there are at least 4 species of prairie plants that are more attractive to bees than you expect. One of them is golden Alexander, Zizia aurea. The other one is one of my favorite plants, Amorpha canescens. The other is Dahlia purpurea, the purple prairie clover. And then the other is the gray-headed coneflower, Ratibida. All of these have in common, they produce huge amount of pollen, they have high flower numbers, they have wide geographic ranges. And the other nice thing about it is that they're very common in mixes and restorations. And so you see these oftentimes being put in, and these are really, really attractive plants for bees. They tend to have, at least for the Ratibida and the Amorpha, relatively long flowering seasons over the various populations. We think there are other plants. We didn't have quite enough data to really nail this down completely, but stiff goldenrod, Culver's root, the Heliopsis, Heliothoides, the Coreopsis, or other ones that we think are also probably attracting bees in greater numbers, species than we think. They are not quite as widely distributed. They do show up in mixes, but their microhabitats where they can be grown may be a little bit more limited. But these are all great plants to get into your gardens. I want to show this just to kind of show you what the actual reality of the pollinator plant networks look like. Across the top here are bee species, and the width of the bar indicates abundance of a particular bee. Don't worry about the names. Down here are our plant species, and also with some abundance values to be indicated by the bar. And these red ones are the plants that we have identified as the ones that are particularly attractive to bees. And you can see all the connectors to these 3 plants, and then a couple more of the ones we think are bee plants. But the complexity of this is overwhelming. And I think it's easy when you look at this to see how what humans are doing are destroying these kinds of networks, breaking them apart, changing them. And we have to sort of think about what things like climate change might be doing to these kinds of networks. So I'm going to end with some things that I think are good for gardeners to do. I suspect in an audience like this with master gardeners, none of this will come as a surprise to you. You're probably all doing the same thing, but for my money, it's always good to get these reminders out there. Put in the native species, things like bloodroot, early, wild geranium, milkweeds, the tuberosa. Here's some of coreopsis from our garden. So get those native flowers out there. They're very important for these bees. Cover the seasons, plant all through the things so you get every season has got something blooming. Fruit trees in the spring, you get byproducts like wild plum jelly off of the tree in my backyard. Create and leave some nesting spots for bees. So we've put out in my yard, I've got bee boxes like this that we have made that are used by those cavity nesting bees. Other kinds of things, bamboo sticks that we've wired together for our nesting bees. I leave some bamboo sticks for bees to use. They'll come in and nest in these stems. I also keep a whole set of cup plant stems with the bees. I think they like them like 3 or 4 years old. It took a while to get some bees in those. And then the other thing is to leave bare ground. You know, it's okay to have some patches of bare ground that are not covered by lawns, because this is a Coletti's bee nest. This is that photo I showed before that are nesting in my front yard, and they're coming back year after year after year in this bare spot. And so I don't sow any seed, grass seed or anything there. Just leave it a little bit bare. Create habitat. Put in edible gardens. You can do that. Put in an urban farm. This is one in a neighborhood near us. And support those urban farms. Kitchen gardens like the one we have in our yard, they're really good for bees, and as well as all those other plants we have in our yards. Put in little pocket gardens. This friend of ours who put in a little prairie pocket garden that's going great guns now after 3 years. So create some habitat for the bees. The other thing is that all those backyards and urban gardens, they actually really do count. They are important. And this is a community garden over across the river near the tennis courts. This is the one in my next door neighbor's yard. This is one of my little gardens in my yard. Only 50 square feet, but it works. And so, you know, little side gardens like this are very important. It does not have to be a big area, does not have to be extensive. There's lots of easy things to do to help the bees to survive. One, mowing. Do less of it. You don't have to mow all the time. And so less mowing is better for the bees. Chemicals, use fewer of them. Use none at all if you can get away with it. The other thing that I had to break a habit of mine is tidiness. I tend to want to have my gardens all nice and tidy and everything's, you know, there's no leaf litter, there's nothing there. Leave some of that, you know, leave some stems. Don't make them so perfectly clean. The bees will like that for that. You don't have to tidy up. And it's a good excuse to go sit on your front porch instead of doing more weeding, for example. Okay, I'm going to end here. I need to thank all of the huge number of graduate students that have worked on various projects, undergraduate students, the whole almond crew in California, 4 years of work in the almond groves. Not a bad place to go in February if you're from Iowa. Work of students in the produce gardens, the urban bee studies, and a whole lot of funding sources that have kept all of these projects going over the last 20 odd years. And lastly, if you have any questions that you don't get, then I'm happy to answer them. Drop me an email. Actually, I think you could even come by and see me now in the university. And so I'm happy to answer questions. I'm looking for, I don't have the chat. I was looking for the chat and didn't see it.
There are
Wait a minute.
questions, Dr. Hendricks.
Oh, right. I didn't have the chat going when I was talking.
Okay.
So yeah, let's turn to some of these questions in the chat. Does heavy mulching of plants hurt or help wild bees? That's a good question. I think that it might hurt them a little bit because the ground nesting bees will like some bare ground. And so, but of course, doing some mulching around your plants keeps the weeds down. So that's not a bad thing. I guess it would be one of those things in moderation that probably won't hurt your bees too much unless you get carried away and every square inch is covered with mulch. That would probably make it difficult for them to get to the nests. So yeah, evidence for bee boxes spreading disease. Yes, I've heard that there is some evidence that there can be some of that kind of spreading, but I don't think it's too big of a problem. One is because you don't have more than one individual will be in a nest box whole, so there's not that kind of sociality that spreads viruses and diseases in a honeybee colony. The other thing that we were able to work on, another study, I didn't really talk about this, we worked on viruses that were attacking and damaging wild bees, one of the causes of colony collapse disorder. And so we looked at viruses, whether or not they were in wild bees and in honeybees. So we did a lot of sampling of that. What we were able to show was that all of the wild bees that we collected had the viruses. Okay, so we collected individual bees and looked for the viruses in the bees. And yes, they're there. So the viruses have moved from the honeybee colonies, or maybe we're always in the wild bee colonies and moved the other direction. We're not sure, but they're all there. So the wild bees have the viruses as well. But the interesting thing was we did an experiment to see whether the viral loads were as high in wild bees and whether it killed them as quickly, and it didn't. And so the viral loads in the wild bees, while the virus at present is much lower than in the honeybees, probably because of the fact that they're solitary. And when we tried to actually kill wild bees with viruses, we weren't successful. So they seem to be more tolerant, probably because of the immune system, the better immune system. I think probably it's not too big a worry for the diseases with the wild bees. Honeybees, that's a different story because of the huge colonies.
So there's a couple questions further up that
Yeah. Okay.
Warming.
The question, failure to find studies that I talked about, particularly those have been done with bumblebees. And are they taking into account, the question is, are they taking into account temperature bloom times due to global warming? My thought on that is that those specific studies are not. taking those into account. Most of the studies, those all came out of University of Illinois, out of Sidney Cameron's lab over in entomology in Illinois, and some of her postdocs and students. They were sampling through the season, so they were getting out there when things were blooming. But so I think they probably got everything that was there, but they're not trying to take into account why there might be less. On the other hand, there are studies that have been done. This is particularly coming out of the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory in Crested Butte, Montana, Crested Butte, Colorado, where they have looked at the changes in bloom time and temperature as you go up in the Rocky Mountains from Crested Butte, and sampling the bees. And indeed, they are finding an effect of temperature change on both the blooms and the locations of bees. As the temperature rises, the plants are blooming earlier at higher elevations, and the bees are moving with the plants. And so the bee distributions altitudinally is also changing for those bees. Now, whether you kind of hit a ceiling on this or some other factor comes into play, I don't think we know. But definitely bloom times are changing for sure. Global warming is clearly affecting that. Whether it upsets the timing between the plants and the bees, my first, of course, I can make these predictions, but as I've already indicated in this talk, there are times I make predictions and I'm totally wrong about them. But what I'm going to say is that the bees are also responding in terms of emergence times to changes in temperature and things like that. So my first guess would be that if temperature change is affecting the flowers, timing, the bees are coming out earlier. So if the plants are coming out earlier, the bees are probably coming out earlier. But there's probably going to be a ceiling or a wall there that one of them hits at some point if it keeps changing.
Okay, Dr. Hendricks, we probably have time for one more question. And I'm going to take the privilege of asking.
Oh, go for it, Doug.
So do wild bees sting and cause allergic reactions? And how many times might you have been stung?
I get that question actually more often than you might expect. Yes, wild bees can sting you. And in contrast to honeybees, when a honeybee stings you, when they go to fly off, the stinger comes out and it also pulls out a lot of the guts with it, and the bee dies. The individual honeybee that stings you dies. Wild bees, not the case. Wild bees, they don't lose the stinger, they just retract it back in, and they can sting you multiple times. And have I been stung? Well, we have 20,000 bee specimens in our collection in the laboratory. And yes, I have been stung. Not very often, though. I've actually had some growing seasons where I've gone out and collected bees all summer and never gotten stung. The worst one I got was when I had a net full of big bumblebee queens, and I was just so excited because I had like 5 bumblebee queens in my net, and you have your net strung out and you put a little tube up in the net and get them in your tube. Well, it turned out that there were 6 in there, not 5, and one of them I didn't have in the top of the net. And that thing hit me 4 times before the collecting tube, the net, everything went flying as I just went, ah! And I had a pretty sore hand for a day or so. And yes, they can cause the anaphylactic shock. So you have to be very careful. And obviously anybody who has those kinds of reactions needs to be very thoughtful when they're around bees. But the wild bees really, they're not like wasps. They don't come after you. You have to insult them to get them to sting you. You have to be doing something that, either you ought not do or you should have second thoughts about, So the collecting, I'm putting myself in harm's way. You know, doing things like walking around. A lot of people get stung on their feet because they'll step on a nest hole and not know it, and the bee will be right in there. And so, but yeah, I've gotten stung a few times. Luckily, I don't have a reaction other than, you know, ah, that hurt.
All right, well, we're just about out of time here. So thank you, Dr. Hendricks, for a fascinating and I think very knowledgeable presentation.
Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to get a chance to talk to you. And
Yeah.
feel free to communicate with me if you got some other questions or you want to know more about what we're doing.
Okay. I also want to thank City Channel 4 for live streaming and videotaping your presentation. Please check the Master Gardener Facebook page or YouTube page and City Channel 4 for times the program will be rebroadcast. If you have any suggestions for future speakers or a topic, please let me or Linda Schreiber know. If you have gardening questions, don't forget our Master Gardener hotline at 337-2145 or send an email to Johnson County Master Gardener at gmail.com. So that's Johnson County COMG at gmail.com. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and have a great afternoon and a productive spring and summer season. Thank you.
Thank you all.